Blessings, good evening to you. We have some questions tonight, and at least one of them is something I think has been asked before. The first question is, can you talk about Lumpur Sangwan Kemako? So I think I have talked about him before, but listening to Dhamma is something that you do repeatedly in the practice. Often you're going over themes and ideas and teachings that you've heard before, but sometimes when your mind is in a new space, more peaceful than before, or has accumulated more understanding than before, then you get something new out of each time you hear the Dhamma, even if the actual Dhamma is something you've heard before. So I'll talk a little bit about Lumpur Sangwan. He was a monk who lived to the west of Bangkok. The end of his life, the monastery he lived in was called Wat Tung Samaki Tham. And he was considered to be a fully awakened Sāvaka, or enlightened disciple of the Buddha. Very much respected by meditation monks all over Thailand, and in both the main sects, the Mahanikaya and Dhammayutta sect. He met Lumpur Cha many times. He'd make a point of going to travel to see Lumpur Cha, meet with him, talk about the Dhamma over the years. So Lumpur Sangwan, he died not that many years ago. Probably was born at the beginning of the 20th century, the early 1900s, into a farming family. Like so many of the enlightened meditation masters in Thailand, started from very humble background, fairly poor farming family, growing rice, and his formal education was minimal, so he just had a year or two of schooling and didn't learn to read or write. When he was a young man, he did become married. He got married. Don't believe he had any children. But very soon after he was married, he became sick, quite ill, almost died. And everybody agreed he was, what you might say, someone with a weak constitution. So he was prone to sickness, got ill. He didn't do very well with the hard work of working the rice fields. So his wife gave him permission to become a monk. And I think amongst his family and friends there was a general agreement that perhaps the monk's life suited him because of his physical weakness and being prone to illness. So he went off to a monastery not far from his home village, Wat Ban Theng, where there was a teacher called Ajahn Kalyano. Maha is a title you get when you study Pali, pass Pali exams. So Ajahn Kalyano was a Pali expert in the Buddhist scriptures. And he'd also been trained in the Burmese method of Vipassana meditation, so what's sometimes called the Mahasi Sayadaw method, which used to be quite popular. So Ajahn Sangwan, as a young monk, he went to live with Ajahn Kalyano, who taught him how to practice vipassana. And because Luang Por Sangwan couldn't read or write, his teacher said he should pursue the practice of meditation. Monks in Thailand often make a choice early on to either pursue a course of study the scriptures, the Pali, the Abhidhamma, the sutras, or they tend to go the way of meditation. A smaller number will go the way of meditation, Kammatthana. And Luang Por Sangwan went that way. And the monastery he was in, part of it was a charnel ground where they have cremations and burials. So he moved into the charnel ground. If I remember, he got an old boat from the river and turned it upside down and made it into a kuti. And so he lived in an upturned boat. And that was his sort of symbol for the vehicle, the raft that leads us to Nibbana, which is the Eightfold Path. It's compared with a raft. So the boat was a reminder that he's on this raft going to Nibbana, cultivating the Noble Eightfold Path. And he had lots of fear, like so many Thai monks, lots of fear of ghosts. So he wanted to live in the charnel ground to cultivate strength of mind, mindfulness, and to learn how to abandon and overcome his fear. So a very brave thing to do. Many monks found it too difficult to stay in such places. But he meditated and stayed in the charnel ground, and he took on many of what we call the Tudonga practices. From the commentary, the Visuddhimagga, you can see there's 13 ascetic practices known as the Tudonga practices. One of them is staying in the charnel ground. There's others such as not lying down, or eating bindabat food you gather from walking amongst the houses without choosing. Just eat your food in your bowl, one meal a day at one time, one sitting, and so on. He took on many of these practices and learned to meditate, practice vipassana, mindfulness of breathing, and contemplation of impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and the selfless nature of phenomena. And he quickly attained states of samadhi, and with this deep samadhi he gained psychic powers as well. He's famous for his ability to know the future, to be, like premonitions. He would have premonitions arise spontaneously in his meditation, warning him of things that may happen. So one of the sort of more ordinary premonitions he would have was he'd always know who was coming to the monastery the next day to visit or to offer food and make offerings. He'd even know on alms round what food he would get, how much, how little, what kind of food. And he, sometimes this particular psychic power would help him because he'd know when there was danger, know when there was problems, when he was going to get ill. So he had, I think when he was about maybe 60 years old, he had cancer in the intestine, and he had a operation to remove it, and they cut out part of his intestine. But he said he had a vision of that in his meditation 35 years before it happened. He had a very clear vision of two people in surgical gear doing a surgery on him and removing part of his intestine. But at that time he wasn't ill, so he just kept that memory, and then 35 years later it came true. Or another time, there was a young lady in the village who became possessed, reputedly became possessed by a ghost. And one of the hazards of being a forest monk in sort of rural areas in Thailand is sometimes people get possessed, and if it's a female, and sometimes they chase after the monk or try and grab a monk or fall in love with a monk or something. So he had a vision in his meditation one night that this woman was going to chase after him. So the next day he was walking through the village, and she had become possessed and started acting very strangely, and she came running out of the house and tried to grab him, wrestle him to the ground. Luckily the other villagers pulled her off him and took her away. But he said he prepared for that, so mentally he was very mindful when this woman jumped on top of him. That's quite hard for a young monk or a young nun to have a member of the opposite sex jump on you when you're celibate. But he managed to keep his rules and his mindfulness in that situation, and partly that was because he had a premonition that it was going to happen. Or there's one time a wealthy family came to the monastery and to make offerings, and the teacher, Ajahn Kalyano, was very impressed with them and thought they might help him build his monastery and do good works. And Ajahn Kalyano meditated and realized this family were going to lose interest in that monastery and go and support another monastery. So he warned Ajahn Kalyano, his first teacher, and said, don't worry about this family, their faith is not strong, they're not going to stay here, they'll move on somewhere else. Because the monk was getting a little too attached to them. And sure enough, not long afterwards, they disappeared and never came back to the monastery. So all through his life he had these kind of visions and premonitions and understandings arise in his meditation, which helped him both in teaching others and in his own practice. So he spent the early part of his life in the charnel ground working to let go of fear, and he said it got to the point where he could just be very content and happy staying in the charnel ground. And any fear of ghosts disappeared, and he would just radiate loving kindness and compassion every night in his meditation. If he ever thought there was a ghost present, then he would just spread metta. So he had no more fear, which is a sign that both his samadhi and his insight was very well developed and very strong, firmly established. No more fear. And he carried on practicing there and also helping his teacher, Ajahn Kalyano, and they sort of were a team. Ajahn Lumpur Sangwan was good at meditation, but he couldn't read or write. Ajahn Kalyano was an expert in the scriptures with great knowledge, and so they had complementary skills and knowledge, and they helped each other. And eventually Ajahn Kalyano sent Lumpur Sangwan to a big temple in Bangkok, Mahathat, which is famous for scriptural studies, teaching the Abhidhamma, teaching the Burmese method of vipassana and so on. And Lumpur Sangwan was teaching himself to read and write, and he went there to learn some of the scriptures once he could read and write, and to check that his understanding of Dhamma from the texts, from the suttas and the Abhidhamma was correct according to his own insight, because the earlier part of his life as a monk he was just working on knowledge of the practice that he'd memorized, and then practiced through developing mindfulness and insight himself, but without much scriptural basis. So he didn't want to go astray or teach people the wrong things, so he taught himself to read and write, and then went to the big monastery to confirm his understanding based on the scriptures. And later on in his life, when he was more established in his practice, he went wandering in the forests of western Thailand and northern Thailand particularly, and he came across one mountain in China province, which is going up north from Bangkok, and it was a mountain which the villagers in that area considered a very auspicious mountain. In those days it's covered in jungle, so it's a place where monks like to go and meditate and stay. Luang Por Sangwan went there and he had very good meditation. His mind became very easily peaceful in samadhi, and he said basically whatever he wished for and desired happened, came true. So he wanted to find water to bathe and drink, and he found water. He wanted to find a nice spot to build a kuti to meditate, and he found it. His mind entered samadhi easily. He was content. He had enough material support from the laity. People helped him. When he got ill, he recovered quickly. So he said, on this mountain, everything good happens. So he built a monastery there, his second monastery. It was called Khao Sarapati, the monastery where everything is good. So it's a nice name for a monastery based on that mountain, which is auspicious. And he said on top of the mountain actually there were ruins of a former monastery, maybe many hundreds of years old. There was just a few stones left. And he said they were very good devas, deities living associated with that mountain, which brought a very good feeling there when people meditated and did good things. So he lived there for many years, practicing. And then later he moved back to Suphanburi province, where his last main monastery was, Wat Tung Samaki Tham, which was just an abandoned old hermitage when he first went there, but gradually over the years, in the 1960s, 1970s, he built it into a huge monastery. And whereas when he was a young monk, he lived in this upturned, disused boat for his hut. In this monastery he built a huge meditation hall in the shape of a boat, like a ocean liner. It was huge. I went to visit him there a few times, and at the top where you would put the bridge, the captain's bridge on the ship, that was where his room was, where he lived, on the top floor of this huge meditation hall that looked like a ship. And basically he said, this is the ship that will take us to Nibbana, and he would teach the laity, monks and laity, so large groups of monks and lay people staying there, taught retreats, taught meditation regularly in his meditation hall that looked like a ship. And he was always a very humble monk. From what I remember of him, I met him quite a few times at Ajahn Chah's monastery and in his own monastery. He was always very humble, not conceited. If you read the translation of the Metta Sutta that we chant in English, all those qualities apply to him. Full of kindness, compassion, humble, not conceited, easy to teach, easy to get on with, radiating loving kindness to all beings. He really seemed to embody that teaching very well. But also very tough, huge endurance, because he was very ill and weak, and he had a lot of physical pain to deal with as he got older. I remember the last time I went to see him, he had a collapsed spine and needed to be supported when he got up to talk. He just was in his bed and we went to see him, and he got up and gave us a Dhamma talk. He said he was in lots of pain, but he said he didn't bother about it because he saw pain as not self. So he practiced his Satipatthana over the years and seen body as not self, feeling as not self. And he'd give very clear talks all about contemplating to see these 5 aggregates, body and mind, as not self. So I can't remember any more teachings or excerpts from his life at the moment. Obviously, he led a full life as a monk and was revered as an enlightened monk. So anyone who met him had great respect for him, and he was very much loved by his students. That's Lumpur Sangwan Kemako. Another question tonight, well, kind of linked. How do you practice loving kindness meditation? Well, like many meditations, there's no one simple technique, cover-all technique for everybody. People often develop their own angle on this. But I'd say one important thing when you're cultivating the object or the theme of loving kindness, you need an object that you find satisfying to your mind to focus your mind on. So you need, could be the feeling of loving kindness, goodwill, friendliness. Could be the words, the phrase, so you can have your phrase. So we have these various verses we recite. So like, may all beings be free from suffering, may I be free from suffering, may all beings be free from suffering. You can go through the chanting of, say, the reflection on universal loving kindness to give yourself an idea, and you may pick one of those phrases and recite it. So you focus your mind on the words and the meaning of the words in Pali or English. Or you can make your own verse up as well. Whatever grabs your mind and you enjoy or feel happy to recite. So it could be one word such as metta or kindness. It could be a phrase. Whatever phrase holds your attention and you're happy to keep reciting it as a way to develop mindfulness on the theme of loving kindness. Or it could be the feeling, maybe in the heart area. So when I was a young monk, I always developed loving kindness as a feeling in the heart. A very warm, loving feeling, and just focusing my mind on that as an object. So as you're doing the meditation, you keep returning your attention to that feeling. Or you keep returning your attention to the phrase such as, may I be well, or may all beings be well. Or some people use a light, and you focus your mind on the light, but the light for them symbolizes love, loving kindness. So strictly speaking, as a meditation, you have to develop mindfulness on the object of loving kindness and keep holding it to the point where all the other 5 hindrances drop away. One thing to remember is any meditation object that you successfully develop with mindfulness to the point where your mind becomes one-pointed, your mental energy gathers together and the 5 hindrances are overcome, well, that will automatically bring a certain amount of loving kindness to your mind because you're no longer angry or irritated with anything when you're in the samadhi. So you could be focusing on, say, on the recollection of death, which sounds gloomy as an idea, but when mindfulness and samadhi arise, the mind is free from gloominess and depression. It's actually very peaceful and happy. And so recollecting the death also brings you metta, loving kindness. So any meditation object successfully done will bring a certain amount of loving kindness. But to develop as a meditation itself, metta itself, well, that's the object you focus on. And it will obviously affect your trains of thought, the perceptions you have in your mind. It becomes something you're perceiving and developing all the time, if that is a meditation you do every day, then it will have a strong conditioning effect on your mind. So it makes the mind very positive, very happy, and you tend to look for the good in yourself and others rather than focus on the faults and the negative things that make you angry. So of course it's the antidote, one of the antidotes to anger. And a good time to practice it is either first thing in the morning to set your mind in the right attitude for the rest of the day, because you go out into the world and meet people, and some of them may irritate you, or some people you don't like, some people give you trouble. So it's a good preventative and antidote to that as you go out into your day. Say, drive in your car, very easy to get annoyed or irritated with other drivers, so you practice metta and you bring up that reflection and the feeling of metta as you're driving, especially if you're prone to anger. Or at the end of the day is also a good time, just before you go to bed. And the Buddha said, just before you sleep, if you spread metta, focus your mind on the object of metta, then you sleep well. The devas look after you. You wake up well, you rest well, you don't have bad dreams, and so on. But of course, like many meditations, you can practice it any time that is suitable. And of course, you also can introduce it, turn to that object at a moment's notice. If you're getting irritated or angry in a situation, you can return to your metta. Because you've practiced it before, then it's easier to do that. So you may be in a situation where you're suddenly getting angry. You didn't even prepare for that, you didn't know it would happen. Something has happened and triggered anger in you, but because you practiced your metta before, the object, the thought of goodwill, you're used to developing that as a meditation. So once you become angry, you quickly return to that thought to calm you down, to help you let go of the anger. But sometimes it's a challenge, it's hard to do, but that's, we're training ourselves, and training takes effort, takes time. And like any meditation, in the beginning you do the very basic. You recite, may I be well, free from suffering, may others be well, free from suffering, free from ill will, free from hostility, and so on. You go through the routine, the basics, over and over again, and develop mindfulness and familiarity with that meditation object. But later, when you become more skilled at it, you're more familiar with it, well, you get to know it much better, and you know some of the more refined states of metta in samadhi, and then also in your behavior, your speech, your actions, and your mind just inclines towards goodwill on ever more refined or higher levels. So your metta, as it were, expands or becomes more profound for you as an experience, and it maybe has that effect on other people as well. And you can practice it more skillfully in different situations. Things that used to make you irritated, as you practice metta more, then they make you less irritated, and maybe eventually they don't irritate you or anger you at all. And you can progress to higher levels of goodwill and kindness. Another question. Why do good people still meet with suffering? Well, if you're born into the world, you will experience some suffering, won't you? Because you've got a human body, and even good people have a human body and they get pain. Good people sit on the ground too long, cross-legged, they get pain in their legs, that's suffering. So there's physical suffering associated with the body, and some of it is just aging and wear and tear and heat and cold and hunger, and some of it is karma, resultant karma from past unskillful actions that come back to you and manifest as illness and injury and stuff like that. And that's just old karma. And so even people who are doing good now have made maybe past bad karma that brings its result. And the same with other experiences we have. Good people still have other people dislike them and criticize them, insult them, hate them, shout at them, physically threaten them, and so on. You can be doing good, but that doesn't mean to say everything you encounter in life will be pleasant and free from suffering. Because we live in this world and we're sensitive beings. We have senses, eyes, ears, tongue, taste, smell, touch. And not every object you experience will be pleasant. It's a mixture, some pleasant, some unpleasant. So for example, even the Buddha, who we say was completely enlightened, completely compassionate, wise, peaceful, his mind was free from any ill will and anger, any craving and attachment, all gone. But the Buddha still encountered people who disagreed with him, were jealous of him, angry with him, competing with him, disliked him. He still encountered feelings of tiredness, he still got ill, he got older and had the pain of old age. So partly this question, you have to look at life and manage your expectations of life and what this world can do for you. It's not all a bed of roses. Remember, roses look good, but they still have thorns. Life is a bit like that. We try to make this world as good as we can for ourselves or the people we love, maybe, but there's always a few thorns around the corner that we haven't noticed or didn't realize, and so you should expect them. Another thorn has come my way. Another bit of illness, another thing gone wrong, another unpleasant situation has arisen with a person who you don't get on well with or doesn't understand you, and so on. But the aim of the Buddhist path is to remove the causes from suffering from your consciousness by removing greed, anger and delusion through the practice, removing ignorance that causes craving and attachment. So you're gradually removing the causes of suffering from your experience. But even when you reach enlightenment, whenever that is, you'll still have a human body that will experience some pain. You still will have to wash the dishes. You'll still be tired, washing your clothes and cleaning up and doing all the things that human beings have to do to survive. There'll still be that to deal with as long as you've got this body. So manage your expectations. But we don't need to create extra suffering out of it. That's the point. You just know with mindfulness and insight, it's like this. So even though there is physical pain or suffering and difficulty in life, the idea is mentally not to attach and create mental suffering out of it. Some more questions. What others say is happiness, the noble ones say is suffering. What others say is suffering, the noble ones know as happiness. Please, can you expound on this? And that was from the Samyutta Nikaya, it looks like, or Sutta Nipata, from the suttas. Well, it's the noble ones are those, the Aryapugalas, the noble ones who have cultivated this eightfold path, Sila, Samadhi, Panya, and purified their view, purified their mind of greed, anger and delusion, developed knowledge and vision, true knowledge and vision of the way things are. So they're no longer deluded and caught up in mental defilements, craving and attachment. So that's a big change. It's a step-by-step change. There's 4 stages of enlightenment, 4 kinds of noble ones. But it's a change in the way they view the world. So the noble ones take happiness in meditating on a object such as the breath and letting go of all the hindrances, and they like to dwell in states of samadhi. That's their recreation. The unenlightened person likes to find recreation in video games, food, sex, fighting, whatever people get involved with, extreme sports, mundane sports, whatever. The unenlightened mind is always looking for something, isn't it? Some sensual object, some object to fulfill the senses, take them away from feelings of suffering, the feelings of discomfort, discontent, so that they can absorb into some sensual distraction for a while. But the trouble is it doesn't last. So the noble ones know that. So they know, oh, this sensual pleasure that everyone seeks for distraction doesn't last. It's addictive and it leads to despair and disappointment because it doesn't last, and you have to keep seeking more of it. You know, that's the nature of addiction, isn't it? It's never enough. You're never satisfied. Always need more, and all the while you're wearing yourself down. You know, you have to go to work in some form or another to earn money, so you can get these pleasures, so you can distract yourself from the kind of mundane sufferings and pains of life. But you know, all of that is tiring. You have to compete with other people. There's problems. There's issues. So that's the nature of the sensual realm we live in. Ultimately, it's dukkha, it's suffering. And the noble ones realize that, so they're not looking anymore for happiness in what is suffering. They seek their happiness in the unconditioned, so cultivating the path that brings the mind to the deathless, the unconditioned. The unenlightened person will look at the unconditioned as boring. You say, oh, the unconditioned, the deathless, emptiness. It sounds, you know, oh, that doesn't sound very inspiring or exciting, doesn't it? You know, it doesn't sound good to the unenlightened mind. So it sounds like suffering, emptiness, the deathless, a state where, you know, there's nothing happening. It doesn't sound very good. It doesn't sound like a good weekend out, does it? And yet it is. It's the highest happiness, the happiness of the mind that is the unconditioned, free from greed, anger, and delusion, free from attachment. So the view is reversed, isn't it? The noble ones know this human body is riddled with suffering because it's subject to illness, pain, aging, and ultimately death. It's a lost cause from day one. This is why Ajahn Chah said, you know, when a baby is born, we all get happy and excited at what's to come, happy for the baby. Of course we are, but at the same time, we should also remember that baby one day will grow up, get old, get sick and die. But we don't like to think of that because it's suffering to us, the unenlightened mind. But the enlightened person sees it straight away. Anyone born into this world must die. It's suffering. So worldly existence is ultimately bound up with suffering, leads to disappointment, despair, because it ends in death. It's impermanent. So the view of the noble ones has changed. They're not looking for happiness in what can't give it. They're wiser than that because they see the true nature of things. So they look for happiness in the unconditioned, the unborn, the uncreated, Nibbana. They're focused on Nibbana. If they haven't reached it yet, you know, they say Sotapanna still has a glimpse of Nibbana, so they have no more doubt of Nibbana, but they're moving towards it. They haven't quite achieved it yet. Whereas the Arahant has. So what does the Arahant do for happiness? Well, they just dwell in a state of emptiness, peace, letting go, relinquishment. They're not expecting anything from the world anymore. They don't expect anything from their body. They don't expect, you know, happiness from the world. They're not looking for the next experience, the next bit of money, the next thing that the world can provide, the next pleasure. The unenlightened person is. We're always looking for the next thing to do, the next thing to have, the next distraction, the next bit of pleasure. So it's a difference, isn't it? The bridge, the way to get from the unenlightened mind to the mind of the noble one, the bridge is cultivate the path, sila, samadhi, panya, and particularly right effort, right mindfulness, right samadhi. And if Ajahn Chah used to say, if you want a glimpse of nibbana, even though it's not nibbana, is develop a meditation object, such as the breath, for example. Let go of the normal distractions of mind, the normal thinking, attachment, obsession with concepts, ideas, theories, the sleepiness of the mind, the irritation of the mind, so on. What we call the 5 hindrances. Experience the mind that is free from the hindrances, if only temporarily, and you get a glimpse of nibbana, because it's the mind that is satisfied and happy within itself. It's not seeking anything outside itself. So then you get an idea, you can be totally happy just sitting, meditating, or walking, meditating. And you don't need anything else. So you get an idea of what the noble ones experience when you experience a bit of samadhi. And we can all do that. We may not be good at it or skilled in it yet, but from time to time you might experience some peace in your meditation, and that's giving you a clue to what the noble ones experience and why they see everything else as suffering and why they seek happiness in the unconditioned. Last question. How to contemplate whatever suffering we experience in order to understand it fully and develop nibbida towards it. Nibbida is this word I tend to translate as turning away, the mind turning away, or losing its fascination with sense objects, with the body, with the pleasures of the world, as we've been discussing. The mind getting bored or tired of always seeking more pleasure and getting attached to things and then suffering because of that attachment. So the mind getting tired, turning away, fed up. But this is coming from wisdom, so it's not the same as being fed up in a way when you're just averse to something, bored with it, averse, and you want something else. So it's not what we call vipavadanha, it's not aversion and wanting to annihilate, get rid of, destroy. It's not the same as that. It's coming from clarity, seeing the way things are. So no longer deluded, the mind naturally turns away from what can't satisfy it or bring it happiness. So Ajahn Chah used to say it's the result of cultivating this path, particularly developing mindfulness, clear comprehension, alertness, energy, and then reflecting, developing insight into the true nature of physical or mental phenomena, seeing them as impermanent, unsatisfactory, not self. The mind naturally turns away from its former attachment or obsession or fascination with things that are impermanent and not self. You can't control them, you can't have them. So what you can't have, might as well let go. You're much happier when you let go of something that you can't have anyway. And this is the whole point. Samadhi gives you a bridge or an avenue into this, but nibbida comes from wisdom, from insight, seeing the true nature of things. And so naturally relinquishing, letting go, disenchanted, the mind doesn't want to chase after those things anymore because it knows they won't bring happiness. So Ajahn Chah also said it's like the kid who gets bored and turns away from his toy. And you notice as you get older in life, you have toys when you're 3 years old. By the time you're 5 or 6, you don't want them anymore. And it's just a natural progression of the mind. You lose interest in them. They don't fascinate you. They don't obsess the mind. Like when you're 3 years old, you have your favorite toy, whatever it is, your doll, your teddy bear, your this, your that. You have it, and anyone takes it away, and you go crazy and scream and shout and fight. And it's who you are. You identify with that toy. Maybe it could be a piece of clothing. It could be anything. By the time you're 5 or 6 or 7, there's just no interest at all. You put them away, and so every household has old toys and old clothes and old games that have been discarded by generations of kids, and you get hand-me-downs. So the older the kid gets, they pass the stuff to the younger kid because they're just not interested anymore. And it's totally natural. Nobody forces that. It just happens, doesn't it, without even trying. Nibbida is like that. It's a totally natural, organic progression of wisdom that just loses fascination with what formerly was fascinating to the mind. We like to think about it, crave it, want it, cling to it. Then it sees, oh, this is not what I thought it was. And you just lose interest, turn away from all kinds of attachment to this body and the pleasures of this body, so the sight, sound, taste, smell, touch, sexual pleasure, and the same for aggression and aversion and fighting, thinking somehow that will bring you an advantage. It won't. So ultimately, turning away from attachment and identification with this body as self. And then of course everything out there that is dependent on the body to have meaning. Other people, material possessions, the world, whatever it is in this world, land, property, money, assets, power, fame, fortune, whatever it is you can think of or attach to, the mind turns away because it's impermanent. And what's impermanent you can't own, you can't have. And that even transfers into heaven realms, the highest ethereal bliss of the heaven realms, the Brahma realms, develop deep states of jhana. Even they can't give us lasting happiness. The only one thing that can is nibbana. So nibbida, nibbana, same root word. Turning away and just losing interest in what can't give you satisfaction and happiness. But it comes naturally through seeing the way things are. It's not a forced thing, it's not something you can do just through willpower or forcing your mind. It's wisdom, clarity. This is why we practice insight, develop insight into the nature of things. Your mind will naturally let go of what it knows is suffering. So Ajahn Kalyano used to say, this body is, he called it like a red-hot ball of iron. So a red-hot ball of iron that you get in a blacksmith's shop or an ironworks of some sort. It's completely red-hot, so it's completely hot, whichever bit you touch. These 5 khandhas, body and mind, feelings, perceptions, thoughts, ideas, and sense consciousness, whichever bit you touch is red hot, it burns you, it's suffering. So the noble path leads to the abandoning of identification with the 5 khandhas. So that's tonight's collection of questions and answers. Hopefully it's been of benefit to you. And we'll leave it there and wish you well.